All right, so let's talk about Mariology. Where do you want to start? Okay, let's do that. Let's list them. And they don't need to be in any particular order.
Mary's the mother of God.
Okay. Mother of God. Number 2.
Immaculate Conception.
Okay, Immaculate Conception. We touched on, I think, most, if not all of these last time, but we'll do it again a little differently. Immaculate Conception. What else? Okay. The Assumption. And? I think that's plenty for us to start with. And then we can go from there. Okay? So, do you have questions about any of those?
I understand all of them.
Sure. Do you understand the scriptural basis for each of them also?
I understand the scripture, the mother of God was pretty straightforward.
Sure.
The scriptural basis, the other ones I think is more like a typology that that's how we get it right with them.
Sure. Okay. Well, let's start with the Immaculate Conception. Because the Immaculate Conception is often misunderstood. Because a lot of people think the Immaculate Conception is Jesus' conception. And while it's true that he was, that he was incarnate without sin, when we talk about Jesus, taking on human flesh, that's the incarnation, and that happens at the Annunciation. So that's separate from the Immaculate Conception. So the idea of the Immaculate Conception is that, so one of the things, well, let's start with the definition, right? So the Immaculate Conception is Mary was conceived without sin, okay? Now, I used to think when I was younger, well, that's because Jesus needed to be, in a vessel without sin, right? Which on one level kind of makes sense, but then you end up with this logic train, which is like, well, wait a minute, in order for Mary to be conceived without sin, then wouldn't her mother have to have been without sin, and then her mother before her, and so forth and so on. And so that logic only carries us to a point, right? So the idea behind the Immaculate Conception has to do with addressing a particular misunderstanding that a lot of people have about the Catholic Church's teachings about Mary. So when we say that Mary was conceived without sin, it doesn't mean, as some people would say, that Mary didn't need a savior, right? Some people will say, oh, well, if you're saying Mary didn't have any sin, so she didn't need to be saved from sin, right? But the idea is that you can be saved one of two ways, conceptually. You can either be saved, like the example that's used very often is, falling into a pit. You can fall into a pit and then somebody can come along and save you by pulling you out, or you can be saved from the pit by somebody preventing you from ever having fallen in there in the first place, right? And that's what we get with the Immaculate Conception, is that Mary is preserved from original sin before she even had a chance to get it. Now, where does this idea come from? I mean, is it nice? Yeah, it's nice. But where does the idea, are you familiar with why it is that this might be the case? Okay, so let's go to Exodus. Okay, let's go to Exodus chapter 20. All right. So if we go to Exodus chapter 20, what do we find in Exodus chapter 20?
The 10 Commandments.
Yes, the 10 Commandments. And if we go to Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, and I'm going to write this up here. Okay. So Exodus 20, verse 12. What do we have there? What does it say?
Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you. Yes.
Okay. Honor your father and your mother. As a matter of fact, the English there, honor, it's not as powerful as the Hebrew. And same thing even in the Greek. The Greek there doesn't capture the idea of the Hebrew. So the word for honor in Exodus chapter 20 in the Hebrew is derived from the word, actually I can't remember off the top of my head what the actual Hebrew word is, but the English translation, one of the ways in which you could translate that is glorify. Okay? And so there's a weight to the word which goes far beyond the word honor. Okay, honor it's not inaccurate, but it fails to capture the full meaning of the Hebrew word there. So if we substitute, for the sake of helping us understand a little bit better, if we substitute glorify your father and your mother, then we begin to understand what the Immaculate Conception is about, right? So how does Jesus glorify his mother? One of the ways is by preventing her from having contracted original sin at all, right? I mean, if you had a choice, if you had the option of your mother having been conceived without sin, I suspect you probably would offer her that also, right? And so Jesus is glorifying Mary, which is where a lot of this, it's one of the foundations for a lot of the church's teachings on Mary, right? If we, through our baptism, are members of Christ's body, that makes us part of Jesus, and Jesus the head is glorifying his mother, well, we're simply doing what Christ the head is doing and glorifying her, whether it's through the Assumption, the Immaculate Conception, the Theotokos, which we talked about last time. All of those things fit into the same idea, right? But this is partly rooted in Exodus chapter 20, okay? And that's where, actually where a lot of it comes from. Do you have questions about that? Does that make sense? Okay. So then let's go to the Assumption. Are you familiar with, so let's define the Assumption.
Mary, instead of dying, was assumed in heaven.
Okay, so that's correct. Mary was assumed body and soul into heaven. Now there's still some debate amongst theologians as to whether or not Mary died prior to being assumed into heaven. Okay, we'll get to that question in a minute. Let's talk about the Assumption itself first. Where do we get this idea of the Assumption from? Where do we find either hints of this in Scripture, or where do we find it more explicitly in Scripture? Are you familiar? Okay, so there are at least 2, possibly 3 different passages which point to the Assumption. Now, some of them are very indirect, and some of them are much more explicit. Okay, so let's take a look at, I think is it 1 Kings? Let me double check here. If it's not 1 Kings, then it's 2 Kings. It's the Queen of Sheba. It's got to be 2 Kings. Okay. Let's turn to 2 Kings chapter 2. Starting at verse 9. Are you familiar with this passage?
I am. Oh, yeah.
Okay, so go ahead and read verse 9 through verse 12.
When they had crossed over, Elijah said to Elisha, "Ask what I shall do for you before I am taken from you." And Elisha said, "Please, let a double portion of your spirit be upon me." He said, "You have asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be so for you. But if not, it shall not be so." As they were going along and talking, behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, which separated the 2 of them. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind to heaven. Elisha saw it and cried out, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." And they saw Elijah no more.
Okay, that's good. All right, so what happened here?
Elijah assumed.
at least somewhere, right?
or something.
So it says heaven, right? So obviously if we take it, at face value, then Elijah was taken up into heaven. However, we know from the rest of church teaching that heaven was not yet open because Christ hadn't come yet, right? Right, likely the bosom of Abraham that Jesus talks about, right? In the parable of Lazarus, right? And so we know that at least one person in the Old Testament was assumed body and soul, right? Because there's nothing to suggest here that Elijah's body and soul were separated from each other, right? Okay, so let's now turn to Genesis. Okay, so if we look at Genesis, let's see. Chapter, let's find it. I gotta find the right, here we go. Genesis chapter 5. Okay, so this is the descendants of Adam. It's actually Noah's genealogy, right? So it lists so-and-so begot so-and-so, who begot so-and-so, who begot so-and-so, who begot so-and-so, okay? So if we take a look, let's start at verse 18. Let's do 18 through 24. Go ahead.
Jared lived 162 years and became the father of Enoch. Then Jared lived 800 years after he became the father of Enoch, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. Enoch lived 65 years.
Actually, you know what? Pause for a second. Let's set up the pattern here. Okay? So let's go back to the beginning of Genesis chapter 5. Right? What are the last three words in verse 5?
And he died.
Okay, and in verse 8?
And he had same thing, and he died.
Okay, and verse 11?
And he died.
And verse 14?
And he died.
And verse 17. Do you see a pattern emerging here? So-and-so, and he died. So-and-so did this, and he lived this long, and he died, right? Okay, and then verse 20.
And he died.
And then read verse 24. What does it say?
Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him.
Does it say anything about him dying? No, so we have this clear pattern of all of these people who died, except Enoch. When you take a look at the rest of the chapter, what we see is everybody else after him died also. Okay, but Enoch, when you read it in context, he stands out as somebody who didn't die. As a matter of fact, you could argue that this is what's called it's a construction used in ancient writing, not just Hebrew writing, but also you'll see this in some Greek writing and other writing from the ancient world. It uses what's called a chiasm. Okay, this is a chiastic structure. Are you familiar with that? Okay, so for those that aren't familiar with it, a chiastic structure comes from the Greek letter chi, which looks like an X. Okay, that's chi. So like when you see in churches something that looks like that, we look, oh yeah, it's a PX, right? It's not a PX, it's chi rho, which is the first two letters of Christ. Chi rho, so it'd be chi rho iota, and then sigma, and then tau, and then omicron, and then sigma again. Okay? Christos. So chi rho, first two letters of Christ, okay, of the word Christ. So here we have, so why is it called a chiastic structure? Because you have this crossing of two ideas, okay? Or I like to think of it as like a mountaintop, okay? So you have everything leading up and then everything that's after, and these parallel each other. So you have this repetition on one side versus the other, and both of those repetitions point to a key element in the passage. So if you take a look at chapter 5, Enoch being taken up, or being no more because God took him, is in the middle of that passage. And so he died, not died. He died. So both of those, before and after, point to Enoch being a particularly important person in this passage, okay? Anyway, so we've got two examples, right? We got two examples of people. So we have Enoch, and we also have Elijah. Okay? Now let's turn to the book of Jude. St. Paul's letter to, I think it was St. Paul's letter to St. Jude, or maybe it was Jude himself that wrote it, but I think it was. It's actually, here, let's take a look at it here real quick. Let's find the exact verse, the letter of Jude. Okay? Where is it?
It's in verse 14.
So there's a passage there that refers to Enoch also, but there's another passage in Jude. Let me find it. I should have highlighted it. Oh, here we go. Let's look at verses 8 and 9. It's what some people refer to as a throwaway verse. Like he says it in passing so nonchalantly, so as to imply, well, clearly everybody knows this, so I don't need to go into it in any detail, right? So what does it say there, starting at verse 8 and then including verse 9?
Yet in the same way these men also by drinking defile the flesh and reject authority and revile angelic majesties. But Michael the archangel, when he disputed with the devil and argued about the body of Moses.
Michael disputed with the devil about the body of Moses. Well, what the heck would Michael be doing with it? Right? So many theologians, many biblical scholars take that verse to mean that in addition to Elijah and Enoch, who are more explicitly taken up, then Moses, ? Okay, it's not as explicit there. Okay? Now, if you're Jesus, and these three guys, at least these two, and possibly this third one, were taken up into heaven, body and soul, wouldn't you want your mom to have a similar honor? I mean, why would you bestow an honor on somebody else which is greater than that of your own mother? Logically, does it make sense? Intuitively, would it make sense that that would be the case? No. Okay? You would want your mother to be the most favored of everybody, right? And Mary is the only one who, in getting back to the Immaculate Conception. Okay, what's the other passage that supports the Immaculate Conception that we commonly use? Yes. Okay, so that's Luke chapter 1, right? So Luke 1:28. Okay, if you look at the Greek there, kekaritomene, kekaritomene. Kaire isn't just hello, howdy, how are you? It's a royal greeting. Okay, like it would have been used to say hail Caesar. That would have been the most common usage of it at the time, was hail Caesar. Well, hail she who has been perfected in grace. And if you look at the way it's constructed in the Greek, the grammar means that
it's a continuing, it has happened, it's a continuing action.
Exactly. And it has no end and has no beginning, right? So it's always been like that, the way that it's constructed in Greek. It's hard to translate that into English, right? But so those are the two key passages there for the Immaculate Conception. Yes. Well, and again, that's another example of, is it incorrect? Or is it inaccurate? No, it's not inaccurate, but it fails to be fully descriptive, right? And that favored one comes from, so the core word in kekaritomene is, excuse me, I misspelled. I'm mixing up Latin and Greek there, okay? So it's How is it written? It's written charis, which is the word for grace. Okay? I'm trying to remember how it's spelled, but I can't remember how it's spelled off the top of my head. In any case, it's written charis. Okay, charitomene. Okay? Charis meaning grace. So, or favor, depending on how you translate the word grace, right? Again, as we talked about previously, you can understand grace as in, well, God thinks nice things about you, right? Or you can think of grace, you can interpret grace to mean God's very own life, right? Which is the way that so God's very own life also includes the idea that God thinks nice things about you. But the fact that he thinks nice things about you isn't fully descriptive. Okay? So anyway, in the Assumption, we have these three people who precede Mary, and so there's the idea, okay, well, it makes sense that Jesus would want his mother to have at least what they had and probably more, right? But do we have evidence of that actually happening in Scripture? We do, okay? So let's turn to Revelation chapter 11. Okay? So we're going to turn to Revelation chapter 11. Now, mind you, we have to keep in mind that in Revelation, this is a vision of heaven that's given to John, right? John is on the island of Patmos. John, the beloved disciple, he wrote, at the very least, the first, second, and third John, and then and the Gospel of John. And many people believe, and I would agree, that the Revelation, the John who wrote Revelation, is the same John who wrote the Gospel, and was one of the 12 apostles, right? Okay, so when we look at Revelation, it's John being given a vision of the Mass, the way it's celebrated in heaven. Okay, it's like the fullest description of the Mass, or the Divine Liturgy if you're an Eastern Catholic or an Eastern Orthodox Christian. The Divine Liturgy or the Mass, the way it's celebrated in heaven. Okay, and so now let's think about this for a second. We have to give some context here, right? So the context relates to his audience. Who would his audience have been made up of? Like when he's telling the story.
For John,
would have been
the disciples and for the Christians.
Yeah, so early Christians who very early on were predominantly, or maybe even exclusively, Japanese,
Or Greeks.
primarily Jews. Okay, it's not until a little bit later that you start to bring in Gentiles. Okay, so the very earliest Christians were almost exclusively of Jewish origin or of Israelite origin. Okay, and so if you're a first century Jew, okay, there are certain key elements in your history which would stand out in your mind, right? And we talked about this a little bit previously when we put up the different milestones in salvation history, right? So you have Moses and the Exodus, which is roughly, depending on which archaeological and scriptural scholars you believe, anywhere from 1200 to 1500 BC. So 1500 years before Christ is born. Okay? And you'll notice there's a pattern here. It's like big events happen in roughly 500-year increments. Okay? So around 1500 BC is Moses. Okay? Who's the big name, or who are the two big names around 1000 BC?
David.
David and Solomon. Right? Okay? So then 500 years later, you got David and Solomon. And then roughly, it's a little bit less than 500 years, but around 500 years after that, what do we have? There's a big event that happens. It's actually 586 or 587. Nope, that's later. The destruction of the temple and the sacking of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, right? So in the 700s BC, the northern kingdom gets taken away by the Assyrians. About 586, 587 BC, then the southern kingdom gets taken away by the Babylonians, right? It gets taken away by the Babylonians. What happens to the ark?
Still missing.
It goes missing, okay? But according to the book of Maccabees, what happened? Ezra, one of the priests, took the ark and hid it somewhere on Mount Sinai. And to this day, nobody knows where it is. Okay? Now, in the Jewish world, through the eyes of the Jews, the ark was the holiest thing there was. There was nothing holier than the ark, right? But what made the ark holy?
It was for God's presence.
Right. So it's what was contained within it and what its function was, right? So you had the ark, and pardon my substandard art, but basically you got this golden box, right? You got these poles that run on either side along the golden box. You had this lid, okay? And what was on the lid? Yeah. So there's these two angels, okay? And pardon my art, okay? I know they look like snowmen, but okay? That's my depiction of an angel, okay? And what's between the two angels?
It'd be the mercy seat.
The mercy seat, okay? And so when God's presence with the Shekinah would come down into the tent and then later on into the temple, his presence would rest on the mercy seat. So basically this is his throne, okay? And according to Hebrews chapter 9, let's turn to Hebrews chapter 9 before we go to Revelation 12. Okay, so according to Hebrews chapter 9, what is contained within the ark?
The commandment tablets, manna, and the Aaron's staff.
Yep, that's right. Okay, so we got three things, right? So we've got the tablets. Okay. Again, I'm not a very good artist. Okay. And then we have the manna.
In a golden jar.
Yep, in a big jar. With a little lid, right? And Aaron's rod, his staff. Okay? With a little flower on it. Okay? It was actually an almond branch that budded off that. Okay? We can go into that even more deeply, but I'm not going to overwhelm you with that, right? With the little details. Okay? So what do these three things represent? What do the Jews call the 10 Commandments? The 10 words. Okay? What is the manna? That was the bread that came down from heaven. Okay? And then the staff represented Aaron's high priesthood. Okay? So you have priesthood, we have the bread that came down from heaven, and the 10 words. Okay? This is what's in the ark. Now the ark is missing. And what made it so holy? These three things, plus the fact that God sat on his throne there. Okay? The ark's missing for over 500 years. Everybody's been looking for it. One of the reasons they've been looking for it is because the Jews recognized that if they were prayerful and faithful and they carried the ark before them, what happened to opposing armies? They would lose. God would just strike them down. Even if they were outnumbered 10-1, God would do something and they would win. You know, and it wasn't always fighting. Sometimes they would see the ark and they would just run. You know? So imagine you're a first century Jew. For centuries now, you've been beat up first by the Assyrians, then by the Babylonians. You have the Medo-Persians in there, somewhere in between. Then the Greeks come along, and finally the Romans. Okay? So Jerusalem is under Roman occupation at this point. The ark is nowhere to be seen. That's the context for John telling the story, right? So let's go back to Revelation chapter 11. Okay? Verse 19. Go ahead and read verse 19.
sounds and peals of thunder, and an earthquake and a great hailstorm.
Okay. So the temple of God, the temple that's in Jerusalem, as beautiful as it is, has it had God's presence since the Babylonians came and destroyed the original temple? No. Because the ark isn't there for God to take his throne, right? So what they're looking for is the temple where they know that they can find God and find the ark. And what does John say? John, who himself is a Jew, says to his Jewish audience, oh, by the way, guys, so I was taken up into heaven, right? That's what it says. On the Lord's Day, it says I was taken up into heaven earlier in the book of Revelation. And he says, guess what I saw? I saw the ark. What's everybody want to know? If you're a first century Jew, we've been looking for this ark for almost 600 years, and now you say, I saw it. I saw it. What would you want to know? Two things. Where, and what's it look like? Right? What's it look like? So he tells them where. It's in heaven. And then, at the beginning of verse 12, he says, oh, you want to know what it looks like? Let me tell you what it looks like. So let's start here, chapter 12. Okay, what does it say?
A great woman appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars.
Boom.
The 6 wings times 2.
So we have, what does it say? A crown on her head and under her feet the moon. So what does she have? She has a head, she has feet. What's in between? A body. Now who is this woman? Now some people will say, well, she's just a symbol of Israel, or she's a symbol of the church. Those things are not untrue. Okay? Let's continue reading. What does it say there? Okay? Verse 2.
And she was with the child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth.
Go on.
Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems.
Sure.
And his tail swept away a third of the stars of heaven, and threw them into the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child.
Go on.
And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne.
Okay. Who's the child?
Jesus.
Is this depiction here simply a representation of the birth of the church, or the birth of, or the renewal of Israel? No. That's a very specific individual, right? Not some hypothetical individual, but a very specific individual. It's Jesus, right? It also mentions a dragon, okay? Is the dragon strictly symbolic of just evil in general? Or is it a particular individual?
Satan.
It's Satan, right? And so we have 2 signs which are particular individuals. What does that make the woman? Another particular individual. Well, the individual being the person who gave birth to the son, Jesus, and we know that to be Mary. Okay? So we know that Mary is where? Because where does John tell us the ark is? In heaven, in the heavenly temple. Okay? So we know it's in heaven. We know she's the ark. And how do we know this idea that she's the ark? Because the original ark carried within it the 10 words, the bread that came down from heaven, and the staff of the high priest. Well, Jesus is the high priest. In John chapter 6, he tells us he is the true bread that comes down from heaven. And John tells us at the very beginning of his gospel that Jesus is what? The Word. Not the 10 words, but the word from which the 10 words are derived. Right? And so that which contains the fulfillment of these 3 things is the new ark. The throne of God, where God himself sits. So we know this to be Mary. Okay, typology tells us that, right? And we know that it's not just her soul, but her body because we have the crown on the head and under her feet, the moon. Okay? Boom. Assumption. Scriptural basis for the assumption. Does that help?
Yeah.
Does it make sense?
It does, yeah.
Okay, what questions do you have about that? If you don't have any, that's okay.
Does that make sense?
Okay, all right.
I remember the last document.
Yeah, go ahead.
Perpetual virginity.
Yeah, the perpetual virginity. Okay, so that, I love that one, okay? So, 4, perpetual virginity.
I know it has to do with the Greek word being like argument taken from Aramaic, where there's no use, like there's no difference between like brother and cousin.
Right.
And then also on the cross, Jesus gives Mary to John, which would be not against the customs.
That's correct.
Siblings.
That's correct.
They use brother specifically, so
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And it also goes back to Luke chapter 1, verse 28. Right now, some people will argue that in Luke chapter, is it Luke or is it Matthew? I think it's Matthew. All right. So let's turn back to, or maybe it is Luke. Let's go to Matthew first. Okay. So we'll go to Matthew. Yeah, it is Matthew, now that I think about it, okay? So, in Matthew, some people will argue here, verse 23. Okay, Matthew chapter 1, verse 23. Okay, behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son. Where does this come from? What's he,
Isaiah.
It's Isaiah. Okay, specifically Isaiah chapter 7. Okay, that's what he's quoting. Okay, and so what's going on there in Isaiah?
I don't remember chapter 7 specifically.
Okay, so in Isaiah, we had the king of Israel who is secretly making alliances with some of Israel's enemies in order to defeat some of Israel's other enemies. But Isaiah has been telling the king, you need to just trust God. If you just trust God, it'll all work out. You don't need to make these alliances with these pagans who are going to corrupt the people. And he's like, sure, whatever. And then behind his back, he goes ahead and makes these alliances. And so Isaiah comes and says, look, God sent me to tell you that he's gonna save the people as long as you're faithful. So he wants you to ask for a sign. Ask for a miracle so that God can prove to you and to the people that he's actually going to carry out his word. So the king is like, I don't need a sign. I believe that God's just going to do what he's going to do. I don't need a sign. I don't want to weary God by asking him for a sign, okay? As a matter of fact, just because the wording there is particular.
I don't know if the Hebrews born Eunice is a young woman.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in a second, okay? So it says, again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz. Ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be deep as Sheol or high as heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test. He's been putting the Lord to the test because behind everybody's back, he's been making these secret pacts, right? Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men that you also weary my God? In other words, you're a liar. You're hiding this from God. So, you know what? God's going to give you a sign anyway. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and call his name Emmanuel. Okay? Now, here where it says, the Lord will himself give you a sign, is it like, oh yeah, he's going to give you a stop sign? He's going to give you a street sign that says Emmanuel on it?
Probably not.
No. What is meant by the word sign there? A miracle. Okay? So it's true that the Hebrew word that's used there could be translated young girl or could be translated virgin. Is it miraculous for a young girl to have a baby? No. But would it be miraculous for a virgin to have a baby? Yes. Okay? So that's what's going on here. So he says, behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and his name shall be called Emmanuel. So Most Christians agree, okay, Mary was a virgin at the time of Christ's birth. But what about afterwards? Okay, so then Matthew says, let's find the specific verse. Verse 25. What does it say?
But kept her a virgin until she gave birth to a son.
Until. It says until, right there in the very next passage, until. Kept her a virgin until. Well, clearly, she wasn't a virgin after he was born, right? Because it says until, okay? But unlike in English, in the Greek here, the word until doesn't necessarily mean a change in status afterwards, okay? You're like, oh, well, that's great, but prove it.
People quote Psalm 110, the same.
Psalm 110 is a great example of footstool, right?
The word says to allow words in my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool.
Right, and then you're not going to be afterwards? No, you're correct. That's a good example. But I have one that I think you'll like even more. Okay, so let's turn to 2 Samuel, chapter 7. Actually, I take it back. Okay, 2 Samuel chapter 6. Okay, so this is right after David gets the ark back from the Philistines, and he's dancing around dressed like a priest. He's so excited to have the ark back. Okay, now one of David's wives. Remember, David was not perfect. He had multiple wives. One of his wives was Michal, the daughter of Saul, the daughter of the previous king. Okay? She hated him. She hated David. Okay? And so one of the things she did to spite him is right there in verse 23. Read it out loud.
Is it 23?
Yeah. Chapter 6, verse 23.
Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death.
Okay? The way it can be translated also is until the day of her death. That's a more literal translation. So if we assume, as we see in English, that until means a change of status before and after, well then, so she had babies after she died? Is that a valid assumption? No, okay? But if you look at the Hebrew there, the word there is often translated until. And if you look at the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew, it's the same word that's used there in Matthew. Okay? But that's one of the arguments people will make against the perpetual virginity of Mary, is that it says right there in Matthew chapter 1, until. Well, there, as you mentioned in Psalm 110, there's an example right here. In 2 Samuel chapter 6, there's another example. Until doesn't necessarily mean a change in status. Okay? Does that help with the perpetual virginity? Okay? The other way you can understand the perpetual virginity is, so one of the things the church teaches, that even during the birth of Jesus, he was miraculously born. She maintained her virginity even through and after his birth. Okay? And you're like, well, how could that happen? And the way that some people have explained it is that Mary is like a window. She's like a window pane. The light can pass through without changing the glass. And that's the relationship that Mary has to the birth of Christ.
I think one of the arguments I've heard against it is, like, consummation was a part of marriage, and so like, she wouldn't be doing her wifely duties, I guess.
Sure.
That's one of the arguments.
And the argument against that, or the counter argument to that, I should say, are the Essenes, right? So there were multiple sects of Judaism at the time of Jesus, and the Essenes were one of them, and it was not uncommon for Essenes to take a vow of celibacy within marriage, okay, as a particular offering to God. And so This is one of the reasons that some people believe that Joseph and Mary might have been Essenes, okay, as opposed to Pharisees or Sadducees or Zealots, or one of the other sects of Judaism at the time. Some people also believe that John the Baptist might have been an Essene, even though his father was a Levite, right? His father was a Levite priest, okay? Does that help with the perpetual virginity? Okay, and we covered the assumption of the Immaculate Conception. We covered the Theotokos last time. Do you have any questions about that from last time? Okay. What else can I answer for you? If you want, we can go into Revelation 12 in a little bit more detail, because there's a few little details there that I find fascinating.
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay, so let's go back to Revelation 12, okay? We'll do that, and then we'll tie up here for the day. So if we look at Revelation chapter 12, there's a lot of little details here that, again, are best understood within a Jewish context. Okay? So let's take a look. Read verse 3.
Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems.
Diadems, yep.
Diadems.
You can pronounce it either way.
And his tail swept away a third of the stars of heaven, and threw them to the earth.
Okay, now skip to verse 9.
And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan.
Ah, ding ding. So the dragon is the serpent, who is Satan. Now let's take a look at this for a second, okay? Let's go back to Genesis chapter 3, right? Yes, he did. Okay? If we turn to Genesis chapter 3, yes, St. Jerome. It says, now what does it say there, verse 1?
Now the serpent.
The serpent. The Hebrew word there, do you know the Hebrew word?
I do not.
It's nachash. Okay? Or some people might look at the way that it's anglicized. Okay, they might look at that and say nachash. Okay? The C preceding the H makes the H kind of a guttural H. Nachash. Okay, the nachash. Which could be translated serpent, but it can also be translated dragon or sea monster or leviathan. Okay, it could be translated a bunch of different ways. Okay, so how do we know that this word is more than just the translation snake? Because we look at Revelation chapter 12 and we see serpent, dragon, they're being used interchangeably. So the nachash here is being translated or means more than just a snake. Okay, now what else? What color is the dragon?
Red.
Why?
Or blood or.
That's part of it. Okay, so let's turn to, actually, let's just do it. Let's go to Genesis chapter, let's find it. (25). Starting at verse 27. Go ahead and read that.
When the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter and man of the field, but Jacob was a peaceful man, living in tents. Now Isaac.
Okay, pause for a second. Okay, so who are we talking about here? We're talking about Jacob and Esau, who are the sons of
Isaac.
Who is the son of? Okay, so I am the God, not me, but Jesus describes God saying he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who is later on renamed Israel, right? Jacob has a twin brother who was born before him. He's born first. His name is Esau. So he has the birthright, right? Okay? So his twin brother is Esau. He has the birthright. Okay? So here we're talking about Esau being a hunter and Jacob being a farmer, right? Go on, verse 29.
When Jacob had cooked stew, Esau came into the field, and he was famished. And Esau said to Jacob, please let me have a swallow of that red stuff there, for I am famished. Therefore his name was called Edom.
What color?
Red.
Red. Okay? So, therefore, he's called Edom, meaning the red guy. Okay? From whom descend the people that are called the
Edomites.
The Edomites. Okay? Now, what do we find out later on? So, at the time of Jesus, Herod is an Edomite. Right? Okay, so the Edomites, who are pissed off at the Israelites because Jacob stole the birthright from Esau. Okay? So your father stole our inheritance. That's how a lot of the Edomites thought of the Jews and the Israelites, right? So the Romans, when they came in and invaded Jerusalem and all of the Holy Land there, they decided to put in a puppet king. Who did they put in?
Herod.
They put in Herod, an Edomite. Why do you think that is? Partly to stick it to the Jews. And because the Edomites were more likely to side with Rome because they're pissed off at the Jews, right? It's this big family feud that's been going on for centuries, right? So the Edomites are pissed off at the Jews, and so like, pick me, pick me. And Rome says, sure, you want to stick it to your cousins there? Go right ahead. Okay? So when we see the red dragon, what do we see a hint of? Some of that animosity between the Edomites and the Jews. Okay? In other words, Herod, in a sense, because Herod is represented by the red, is siding with the devil. Okay, that's what it's hinting at. Okay? The red dragon, who is Satan, who is the serpent in the garden, the Nachash, that's in the garden. So this is all tied together. Okay? And then we see the diadems, which are basically a kind of crown. And then the 10 horns. The horns are representative of royal power. Okay? And obviously the crowns are also representative of royal power. The reason there are 7 of the diadems and 10 of the 10 horns has to do, like, you can trace it out amongst the different rulers that have ruled over the people of Israel over a period of time. Okay? I thought you might find that interesting. Okay? What other questions do you have?
I guess also kind of going into like verse 6. Then the woman, Revelation 12:6. Then the woman fled to the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God. So that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. Why that many days?
So when did Jesus and Mary go off to a special land set aside for them by God when they were hiding from this red dude who had royal power? They ran to Egypt. Okay? That's likely the time, it's likely a reference to the time that Jesus, Mary, and Joseph fled to Egypt until what happened? Until Herod died.
Yeah.
Okay? So these are all poetic hints pointing to Jesus, pointing to Herod, pointing to particular things at the time that identified who was who and when it was happening. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, if you don't have any other questions, I think we're going to call it a day.
I think that's all I have. Yeah.
All right. Any-